Something changed in the 1840s. Not gradually, not through some natural evolution of medical understanding, but suddenly, decisively, as if someone had flipped a switch. Across the Western world, massive stone institutions began rising from the ground at a pace that defied explanation. These were not hospitals in any conventional sense. They were fortresses designed to hold thousands, built with architectural precision that seemed impossible for societies supposedly just emerging from pre-industrial limitations. And they filled almost overnight, not with criminals, not with the violently insane, but with ordinary people whose only crime was remembering. Between 1845 and 1890, the number of psychiatric institutions in North America exploded from roughly a dozen to over 300. Britain saw similar growth, jumping from 20 facilities to more than 120. France, Germany, Russia, Spain, Italy, the Austro-Hungarian territories, every nation participating in this strange synchronized expansion. All at once, as if following instructions no one had written down. The official story calls this progress, humanitarian reform, the enlightened treatment of mental illness. But the deeper you examine the pattern, the less that explanation holds together. Because here is what they never tell you. Small towns with populations of 15,000 people were building asylums designed to house 2,000 patients. Rural areas with no factories, no urban crowding, no apparent source for mass psychological crisis, constructing institutions as large as those in major cities. The mathematics break down completely, unless you accept that something else was generating this sudden need. Unless the patients were not coming from the towns themselves, but from somewhere the official record refuses to acknowledge. I started noticing the architecture first, the way these buildings mirrored structures from an earlier era, an era that officially never existed, the same massive stonework, the same impossible precision in construction, the same architectural language we see in buildings attributed to a civilization no history textbook mentions. Many of these asylums appeared complete in historical records, fully operational as if they had always been there. No construction photographs, no progress reports, no documentation of the years it should have taken to quarry that much stone, to assemble those walls, to engineer those ventilation systems. Just sudden existence, as if someone had simply changed their purpose, repurposed them from something older into something new. And the patients themselves, the records, where they survive, paint a disturbing picture. Not of violent madmen or those suffering from obvious mental collapse, but of people exhibiting specific symptoms that appear again and again across continents. Temporal confusion, false memories, insistence that the physical world had changed, descriptions of buildings that no longer existed, streets that sat at different heights, architectural features buried under earth and stone. Individuals who could not reconcile what they remembered with what they were being told was real. People asking the wrong questions about why basements had become first floors, why entire neighborhoods sat meters lower than the surrounding streets, why the historical timeline made no sense. The diagnosis was always the same: delusional, suffering from confabulation, detached from reality. But what if their reality was simply different from the newly written narrative? What if they were witnesses to something that needed to be forgotten? Consider the timeline more carefully. Between 1750 and 1850, cities across the globe show architectural evidence of rapid burial. Ground floors converted to basements, windows opening onto compressed earth, doorways designed for human passage, now sealed by soil and debris. We see this pattern in St. Petersburg, in Paris, in London, in Boston, in San Francisco, in Melbourne, in Buenos Aires, in Edinburgh, in Prague, in Istanbul. Cities that had no contact, no shared engineering tradition, no coordinated urban planning, all displaying identical evidence of disruption. And always, the same absence of documentation explaining what happened. The official explanations crumble under examination. They tell us streets were raised for drainage. That ground was added gradually over decades for urban improvement, but the scale contradicts this. You cannot bury entire first floors, convert ornate entrance windows into basement apertures, and raise street levels by 3 to 15 feet through gradual urban planning. Not simultaneously, not across continents, not without massive documentation of such undertakings. The silence itself becomes evidence. And right in the middle of this window, right when the architectural evidence suggests something catastrophic occurred, the asylum boom begins. Not coincidentally, not through separate causation, but with suspicious precision. The same decades when cities show signs of burial are the exact decades when institutions designed to contain memories begin rising across the Western world. Ask yourself a simple question. If a civilization-altering event occurred, if the physical landscape was fundamentally transformed, what would you do with the witnesses? The people who remembered when those basement windows were ground floor entrances, the individuals who insisted the buildings were taller, the streets lower, the world different. You could not simply eliminate them, not without creating martyrs, not without drawing attention to what you were trying to hide. But you could redefine them. You could medicalize their testimony, transform their memories into symptoms, make truth itself a disorder requiring treatment. The expansion of diagnostic categories during this period tells its own story. Before 1840, insanity was narrowly defined: severe disruption, violent behavior, obvious cognitive collapse. But between 1840 and 1880, the definition exploded to encompass almost anything. Religious enthusiasm became committable. Political radicalism qualified as madness. Unconventional behavior justified permanent institutionalization. They even created a diagnosis called nostalgia, literally homesickness, that could land you in an asylum. And monomania, obsessive focus on a single topic, particularly when that topic involved historical inconsistencies or architectural anomalies. The case files that survived are disturbing not because of what the patient suffered, but because of how thin the justifications were. A woman claiming her city used to look different. A man remembering buildings that did not exist in current records. People describing streets at different elevations, structures buried under earth, a timeline that did not match what they were being told. Not criminals, not revolutionaries. Not dangerous in any conventional sense. Dangerous only in what they knew, in what they remembered, in their refusal to accept the revised history. And here is where the pattern becomes impossible to dismiss. This was not a regional phenomenon. It was global, and it was coordinated. Britain passed the Lunacy Act in 1845, mandating asylum construction in every county. France enacted identical legislation the same year. The United States saw state after state pass commitment laws throughout the 1840s and 50s. Russia, Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, all implementing psychiatric institutionalization on unprecedented scale. Japan began constructing Western-style asylums in the 1870s, despite having no prior tradition of institutional psychiatry. The Ottoman Empire followed suit. Even colonial territories in Africa and Asia saw asylum construction, often before basic hospitals or schools. The architectural uniformity alone should raise questions. The Kirkbride Plan, introduced in 1854, became the template for asylum construction across North America. But similar layouts appeared simultaneously in Russia, in Argentina, in Britain, in Australia. The same batwing structures, the same imposing symmetry, the same advanced construction techniques. How does identical architecture emerge simultaneously in societies with minimal contact, different medical traditions, different governmental structures, different economic conditions? Not through convergent evolution, not through natural cultural exchange, through coordination that officially did not exist. And the speed. These were massive stone complexes, some designed to hold thousands of patients. The craftsmanship required years of skilled labor, enormous resources, sophisticated engineering. Yet they appeared in compressed timeframes that make no sense for the stated technological capabilities of mid-19th century construction, unless, of course, they were not being constructed from scratch, unless they were being repurposed, converted from structures that already existed, built by hands we are no longer supposed to remember. The deeper I examined asylum records, the more I noticed systematic gaps. Patients with no documented history prior to admission. No family connections, no established residence, no paper trail suggesting they existed before entering the institution. Just names, dates of admission, vague descriptions of symptoms, as if they had appeared from nowhere, or as if their previous existence had been deliberately erased, their records purged, their identities stripped away along with their memories. Try to find detailed personal accounts from asylum patients in the 1850s through 1870s. Try to locate their testimony in their own words, unfiltered by institutional interpretation. The records are sparse, heavily mediated through psychiatric authority, and where they do survive, they are dismissed as the products of disordered minds. Patient writings were often destroyed as therapeutically counterproductive. Direct testimony was transcribed by asylum staff, interpreted through diagnostic frameworks, preserved only when it confirmed institutional assessments. The silencing was systematic, comprehensive, and deliberate. And when these institutions were finally abandoned in the 20th century, as psychiatric care shifted to other models, what happened to decades of documentation? The admission records, the case files, the daily logs that should chronicle every patient, every diagnosis, every treatment. Destroyed, lost, inaccessible. Fire damage, water damage, deliberate disposal. The destruction often occurred immediately before buildings were demolished or repurposed, as if someone wanted to ensure those records would never survive into an era of independent investigation. What haunts me most is not what the records say, but what they refuse to say. There is no discussion of the strangeness, no acknowledgement that something unprecedented was occurring. The 19th century medical establishment treated the sudden explosion of mental illness as natural, expected, unremarkable. No journals questioning why psychiatric pathology appeared to increase exponentially. No public health officials investigating the cause of this apparent epidemic. Thousands of people across Europe and North America suddenly requiring permanent institutionalization, displaying remarkably similar symptoms centered on false memories and temporal confusion, all within the same narrow time frame. And the response was not curiosity or investigation, but immediate commitment, permanent separation, systematic silencing. The asylums filled, the mudflood became myth, the witnesses became patients, and the testimony became symptom. Truth itself was redefined as a disorder requiring treatment. And within 2 generations, the world before was forgotten, buried under earth and rewritten history in equal measure. Many of these institutions show the same half-buried characteristics as other structures from the period. First floors below ground level, windows opening onto soil, foundations suggesting they either predated the burial event or were constructed immediately after on ground that had recently risen. The Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in West Virginia, the Athens Lunatic Asylum in Ohio, all displaying evidence of the same disruption we see everywhere else. But unlike civic buildings or churches, asylums were not celebrated as architectural achievements. They were built, filled, and quietly forgotten. I cannot prove definitively what occurred. I can only show you what does not make sense: the synchronicity across continents, the architectural uniformity in societies with minimal contact, the expansion of diagnostic categories to encompass memory discrepancies and historical confusion, the vagueness of patient origins, the systematic destruction of records, the impossible speed of construction, the immediate filling of institutions before local populations could generate such need. All of it clustering around the exact decades when architectural evidence suggests catastrophic disruption. Why did the asylum boom happen precisely when the Mudflood timeline indicates global upheaval? Why were commitment criteria expanded to include symptoms that sound remarkably like testimony to a different historical reality? Why were these institutions built with such urgency, such capacity, as if someone knew in advance that large numbers of people would need to be institutionalized simultaneously? Why do records from this era remain so difficult to access, so fragmentary, so carefully filtered? And why does questioning this pattern immediately invite dismissal, not on evidential grounds, but because the question itself is treated as inherently unreasonable? The evidence suggests something far larger than medical reform, something that required simultaneous construction of containment infrastructure across the globe, something that needed testimony suppressed, witnesses removed, alternative narratives pathologized, something that could not be accomplished through obvious censorship or violence, but required the authority of medical science to legitimize the erasure. How do you erase a civilization? How do you rewrite history on a planetary scale? How do you silence witnesses without creating martyrs? How do you make truth itself a symptom of madness? You build the asylums. You expand the definitions. You medicalize memory. You institutionalize reality itself. And you wait for time to finish what force could never accomplish. The official history calls it progress, the evolution of psychiatric care, the enlightened response to mental illness. But the architectural evidence whispers something else. The timeline reveals a different story. The systematic gaps in the historical record point toward a truth that had to be buried as thoroughly as those first floors, as completely as the civilization that built them. These were the witnesses, and we built fortresses to hold them. We diagnosed their memories. We institutionalized their reality. We made truth itself a treatable condition. And somewhere in those lost records, in those destroyed case files, in the silence where testimony should exist, the real history remains, waiting for someone willing to ask the forbidden question, not whether the asylums were built to heal, but whether they were built to make an entire world forget.